Martha's a local painter. You've been part of the Oxbow Gallery for, I think, 8 years. That's a long time. And Martha has taught and lectured widely. She's exhibited widely. She's received numerous awards, and we're so happy to have her be part of our community. The title of your talk, What About Paint Without a Question Mark?
Thank you all for coming. I really think this gallery is a marvelous institution, and there are many people to thank who worked very hard for it, but especially Justin Kim, who's here tonight, who really did the lion's share of putting it together when it got started. I didn't know what I was going to talk about, there is an actual direction in this talk, although it may not be obvious at first. And I found this quote the other day, and I think it was in the New York Review of Books, talking about Mark Twain. To string incongruities and absurdities together in a wandering and sometimes purposeless way was the basis of his art. And this is Mark Twain talking about himself. So I took courage from that. I thought, well, you're going to have to sort this out. Maybe it will make more sense tomorrow. I've been reading all kinds of things, because when I'm painting, I don't think about painting. When I'm painting, I'm painting. And that's a completely different idea than trying to work up things to say about painting. And so to provoke myself, I've read Richard Wollheim and Yves Alain Bois and John Elderfield and Donald Cuspet and all kinds of other people, just to provoke myself, and I'll try to give credit if I'm using one of their ideas. But Wollheim talks about, and painters don't ever think of this, that when you're painting, you're not really a spectator of what you're looking at. You're like driving a car. You're going down a road, and you kind of know where you're going, and you focus on the road and kind of the direction you're going, and you have some ideas in your head about where that direction is, but you're not looking at the trees, and you're not looking at how this goes with that or anything like that. You're not focused on what the spectator who looks at the painting is going to see. And of course, the artist ends up being the spectator. But while you're working, you're not thinking about that. You don't think about where you're going. I'm going to talk about these things in relation to a number of painters, and they're certainly not in any sequential order. But you have to remember all these, because I may refer to some painting that I've already talked about, so there'll be an exam at the end, so keep an eye on what's happening. The eyes and the gaze of whoever, the spectator, the person in the painting, what we think about eyes, what work means to the painter, and what are influences, one painter to another, and what interests me. I mean, I've certainly thrown in a number of paintings that interest me. The reason I put up this little painting of a sculpture, and I must have taken this in a museum, probably in the British Museum, of maybe 600 BC, but the fact that she's dancing and there is this energy and vitality, and it is so old. And yet we can totally relate to this, that we are all human, and no matter where we've gone in painting, this always has to come back to us. It always has to have something to do with us. And I wanted to go back to something very early and say we're still all connected. I mean, I could have used the Venus of Willendorf or some prehistoric figure that we're all, I mean, having fertility, having a child is still very important today. I mean, people do care about the world continuing, and that's really what that's about. But dance has always been a kind of radical thing, that dance has often been outlawed in societies. So that's another reason I wanted to use this particular figure. And what are all the things we bring when we look at a painting? You know, this is an Alex Katz, and you look at it and you think, well, it looks like a billboard. It has a kind of, it's big, it's simple, it has a kind of impact of a billboard. It has this flower in it. It's clean. It's cool. I mean, you can think iced tea. You can think being out in the country. it has a certain, there are all kinds of things that we look at this that we can bring right to the image that you will not bring when you look at this. This is a Gustav Klimt, and it was done a little bit before the Alex Katz, but it has a very different, it calls up a very different feeling. It's also a painting of a woman. It's also large. It is Judith and Holofernes. It is hot. It is sophisticated. It's almost claustrophobic, where the other one is not. It is heartily innocent. It is rich. It has many connotations. I think of chocolate. I think of jewels. I think of lots of things that don't come into my head at all looking at the other painting. So we bring, no matter what the image is, we bring all kinds of things to it. I've put in a couple of David Parks because David Park is a painter who interests me a lot. I used to think he looked like Diebenkorn and Elmer Bischoff, but he doesn't at all. He's very different. He's certainly about figures, about figure painting. Again, a little painting of a little Etruscan statue that's no more than 5 inches tall. But here are people standing, there's a woman standing around with a cloth. It took me forever to realize that what's between her legs is this cloth, like these men standing there on the beach, these figures that are bathing, and she sort of calls up a similar stance of a human being, done much, much earlier. And I love the Americanness of David Park's paintings, the kind of, they're not precious at all. And he's coming out of abstract expressionism, and yet he wants to go back to figuration, to paint figures on the street or standing on a beach. And yet I've had the experience of going into, when Salander O'Reilly existed, of going into seeing a whole exhibit of his work and coming out just feeling I'd been in church or something. I'd been in, I'd had a very moving kind of spiritual experience, that this was, that his images to me they're crude and not, I think there's one more here. I used to feel like there was a certain kind of brutality, and yet I really think it's more a sense of humanity about the way he'll put together a figure. This is a drawing done by Millet, Jean-Francois Millet, who I like the way the surface is woven together. I found this drawing by Mondrian that looks very similar, and certainly Mondrian must have been looking at Millet. And at Van Gogh, who copied a lot of Millet's. Where Mondrian ended up, he went to Paris right before World War II and encountered Cubism for the first time and was fascinated by what he saw in Cubism, where Cubism was going, that Cubism was going away from a visual likeness of something, and why. But it always was after a likeness of something. And Mondrian was trapped back in Holland during World War I. Did I say World War II? I meant World War I. He was back in Holland and had to stay there during the war. If you're in Holland, you know that the sea is the primary thing that you're aware of, going from one place to another. The sea is terribly important as an experience, and much of Holland has been reclaimed from the sea. It's, and how to transform this experience to a two-dimensional surface. That the problem is that horizon line, like he's sort of dodging it by making the blue clouds come up and the horizon line almost disappear between the plane of the land and it makes the sky seems vertical, but then it comes back over your head. And he took from Cubism an idea of transforming it into an image that would make sense as a transformation, not as a visual representation. I grew up in the Midwest and really didn't experience the ocean until I was in college, and it really shocked me to go in the water and taste salt. You know, that was shocking. And then to come out and have my feet all cut up by barnacles so they were bleeding, so I still tasted salt. And then to try to paint it, to try to draw, to try to paint it. And every time you put something in there, like a rock or something, it would it would destroy I mean, it would just be like a crutch. Like, this is not helping me at all. Like, I can't put something in there. How do you just deal with that water and the sky? And so I was back in Pennsylvania, and I was sitting in my living room, and I did these drawings where I said, well, eliminate the horizon line. That destroys everything because it comes right up in the middle. You have to paint something over your head and under your feet, and then out a little farther, and out where the first waves are coming in, and then out a little farther, and then I thought, and you have to connect them. This has to connect to this has to connect to this. And then I thought, oh, it looks like bars. You know, this is a jail. This doesn't work. So I broke the line, and I started connecting and going back to something sort of in the middle of the drawing. And this is what it looked like. And I just thought, in a sense, this is exactly what Mondrian was doing. He was putting together, and then, of course, it's not square. It has to be in a circular space. So I drew this oval around it, and then it came up exactly like this painting. Mondrian called all these paintings Pier and Ocean, which then suddenly made a lot of sense to me. But after this period, he went through a long time of working with the Distill movement, which meant the style with Theo van Doesburg, and then he had a falling out with Theo, which Alan, my husband, gave me this quote this morning, which I just love. This is perfect. He said, following the high-handed manner in which you have used the diagonal, all further collaboration between us has become impossible. For the rest, sans rancune, which maybe means it was like without grudge, no grudges, just, we cannot work together. You have established a diagonal, and I am absolutely against the diagonal, and we may not use a diagonal. And I think there are a lot of people like Walter Benjamin and Yves Alambois and other people who've explained that, well, Mondrian has to have, the Distill movement was really about history, about everything coming from history, and about essentials. What's essential? What's absolutely essential to the drawing, and eliminating everything else. He didn't want anything figurative. He didn't want a reference to the physical world. He wanted to translate into some kind of object, some kind of form that would not make this kind of relationship to the real world, but that this idea of gravity, this idea of the vertical, because you're a human being on the earth, was very important. So a diagonal, unless your eyes, unless you want to go down like this is not going to work. You actually are like this. If the eyes were some other way, maybe a diagonal would be okay, but since that wasn't true, the vertical and the sense of gravity really was very important. Now, this is skipping a long period, but this is going to the end of Mondrian's life, to when he came to New York after World War II. And he'd given up the black lines, and he still uses red, yellow, and blue, but in these pieces, these I won't call them lines because he did not want you to call them lines, but in this grid, these overlapping forces, or what he wanted to set up was a rhythm. And I've read around and around in this, and what I finally come up with is that it's impossible to really justify everything he was doing earlier in terms of what he started doing when he came to this country. That it's not a consistent statement, but I think that's what makes it interesting. That even after supremacism, Malevich said we couldn't really make it work. He wanted to also eliminate everything, and I think that when I read Malevich, I read someone who went through the early 20th century in Russia and wanted to eliminate everything he knew, and that the course of his abstraction was in trying to get away from everything he understood about the world to that point, and how important that was. But for Mondrian, that may have been true also, but it was a very, and I don't use this word negatively, zealous pursuit of a kind of ideal of eliminating anything that would get in your way of perceiving the painting as an object, perceiving the painting really as almost a piece of sculpture, and often his work was compared at this point to sculpture. But he was also very interested in the rhythm that these verticals on the canvas set up, and how the blues interacted with the reds and with the yellows. And the balance had to be many more yellows than blues and reds, because yellow is not as strong as blue and red. Is it Charmian van Weegelen who worked with him in New York and spent time in his studio, and said that he would practically dance while he was working on his paintings, that he did this kind of footwork. He was very interested in jazz, and his next paintings after this were called Broadway Boogie Woogie and Victory Boogie Woogie. But these paintings called New York City, and there was really only one of them that was known at the time he died. He was trying to get at something that had a syncopated repetition as capable of destroying objective expression of forms. And I think that he wanted to he talks about, he didn't want the paintings to be too tall because that sort of brought up something Gothic, like a figure. He didn't want them to be horizontal because it brought up the idea of landscape. So it had to be something kind of in between that, and to be as far away from anything that made you think of the physical world, that it had to be an object by itself. He was very against like wall painting, because he would not have wanted his painting to be part of a wall. It had to be independent from the wall. It's hard to put together some of the things he says with what you end up with, and I know that there are people who think this is nothing but reinventing the plaid, but I think that there is that the passion of his pursuit is really what he's coming up against, and which makes him eliminate until he gets to this kind of statement. He insisted he painted from intuition, which I think is also interesting. We think, oh, he's so logical, and, you know, well, is he? That's why I said that I'm not quite sure I can buy everything he says about what he does, but I think that if you're reading between the lines, he's telling you absolutely what he's doing. This is a Picasso Blue Period painting, and one of the things Wollheim talks about, and these are lectures he gave at the National Gallery, and they must have been, all these people who gave these lectures at the National Gallery are really astonishing, from Meyer Shapiro to theoreticians in the art world, and music, and other forms of art too, poetry, theater. He talks about the blue period. I've always felt the blue period and the rose period, that what if Picasso's life had ended there? What would we think about his work? And he talks about the eyes in these paintings, and the diverted gaze, and how quiet they are, how unassertive they are compared to what was coming. And one of the paintings that certainly has fascinated people is the blue guitar. And the blue guitar player looks blind. I don't know whether that's something Wallace Stevens talks about in his poem, but the idea of being blind in relation to seeing, like Tiresias, and this is coming out of Catching the Light by Arthur Zion, who was a physics professor at Amherst, a fascinating book about the eye and the mind. That Tiresias was a blind soothsayer in the ancient world, and he apparently, supposedly, he was a demigod. He had looked at Aphrodite, and that the power of his look could violate her, that his eyes could violate her by seeing her in the nude. And she made him blind to suffer the consequences of his doing such a thing. We have such interesting ideas about the power of the eye, or the power of the gaze, or the power of seeing, that used to be believed that the light was in the eye itself. There have been all kinds of theories about the eye until the 20th century, until people knew more about it. And then there are lots of studies of optics, as if it's all happening out there. But here is this blind guitar player. And I know This is what I mean, digression. Okay, this is Matisse's Blue Nude, and Matisse, when he exhibited this in Paris, it was scandalously received. It was simply, the critics didn't like it and didn't understand it. The other artists said, my God, what is he? He's lost his mind. He doesn't know whether he wants to paint a decoration or a nude. But it made Picasso extremely jealous that he got all this attention from this scandal. And this is John Elderfield. And the next painting he did was Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, which is full of eyes looking out at you in a very aggressive and ferocious way. And this was really in response to this painting changed enormously after the Blue Nude was exhibited. And it's believed that Picasso used photographs. We know there was a great interest in African masks at this time. The eyes in these figures look as much like ancient Sumerian heads as they do African masks. And this is another Sumerian head. It's missing all the wood of the rest of the head, and just the gold face is still there. But obviously, in a very important gesture, her hands are together, and she must have had a lot of hair in this, but the eyes are exaggerated, and the seeing eye of some kind of inner and outer light. Now, Picasso went on to do these analytic cubist paintings with Braque. Matisse had nothing to do with that. Certainly Cubism is one of the most important things that happened in the 20th century and has been invented upon and invented upon and invented upon by numerous artists. The idea that it was abstracting really has never, doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And that in a way it was trying to say this is the way the artist sees. That photography had become so important at this point. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later, that different theories of photography at the time of Manet, that photography had become so important it was almost imperative that artists come back and say, and reassert themselves and the way a human being sees as opposed to a camera. This is a figure, this is called a guitar player, another guitar player. And it's kind of saying, I see the top of his head, I see this piece of his head, I see this piece of his shoulder, I see this piece of his arm, rather than trying to make a likeness. That he's recording his experience of seeing. And he's almost using the colors of a photograph. I think there's something very dynamic and assertive about Cubism that drifted off for a while into things more decorative, but I'm going to bypass that for the moment and go on to Manet. Manet has always been a painter who's fascinated me for a number of reasons, and I know a few years ago, and I'm sure Gary heard this talk, I gave a talk at the Smith Faculty Club on the Manet in the Smith College Museum, which I had heard from so many people was their most unfavorite painting. And I found the painting fascinating. There's an article that came out about a year ago in the Art in America, I think, by Lexi Worth on photography and Manet. And I remember saying in that lecture that it looks like Manet may have used photographs, although it's been denied and denied. Kurt Varnadotte just took that idea and tore it up and threw it away, and nobody's been able to talk about it since. Manet took lots of photographs, and he was a very good friend of Nader's. And, but he must have buried his tracks. You know, we don't have any photographs left that he used. But I'm going to go through a series of Manets and say, you know, what's interesting that he took from photographs and what's interesting that he didn't take from photographs. That this is probably a snapshot of this woman smoking this cigarette. And she's, to me, the perfect Carmen. You know, she's called a gypsy with a cigarette. It's in the Princeton Museum. I tried to pick paintings that are around here that you might have seen in the flesh. This is a painting in the Smith Museum, and it's interesting. I could not come up with any image of this without this frame around it. Marguerite de Conflans, who was a family friend of Manet's. Manet used to spend a lot of time with her family. She was 18 years old. He took a photograph of her, and he did this painting from that, which doesn't look, I mean, let's look at that for a minute. This painting, to me, doesn't have half the interest of that other. It's really kind of mundane, you know. It doesn't have the quality of this painting, where this painting is a mystery. It's kind of a puzzle. You can't really, first of all, she's losing her clothes, which makes it a little bit exciting. She's let her hair down. She doesn't have a face kind of put together with a certain amount of information. He's kind of made the face become an oval and regularized it in an abstract way. The sofa behind her that she seems to be sitting in seems to be facing one way, and she is facing another way. She is facing frontally, and as Alexei Worth points out, that most of the paintings of Manet's, and he's using completely different paintings than I am, always are front lit, and a camera will use paintings that are front lit. It became right away the way to take a photograph. Have the sun behind you and take the photograph this way. And that was never done in painting because it flattened out the image. Well, it may be exactly what Manet wanted to do, to eliminate a lot of tones. He has studied with Thomas Couture, who thought you could never have too many tones, and Manet felt, no, you really have to simplify it to maybe 3 or 4 tones, that was important, that this kind of simplicity was important. He also made a point of kind of making his paintings a little bit awkward so people wouldn't think that he's working with photographs, because Baudelaire said, my gosh, Daguerre is a messiah, and Daguerre is a I can't quite remember what it was, but that it's a monstrous idea to use photographs. He felt it was a completely monstrous idea. Now, Delacroix felt that using photographs was okay, it might be a great aid for the artist. And Daguerre himself, or Nader, Manet's friend, said, photography is an art form, and we are going to have a salon of photography. And they did have a salon for photography. It drove Baudelaire wild that they would have such a thing, that he felt it's good for some kind of details. Well, that's what happened. A lot of artists started using photographs, and they could incorporate any number of details. And this is not what Manet took from it. So no one's been suspicious that he used photographs. So we're going to skip over this, and the head has much more in common with this idea of a head, of Piero, and these strange fingers. And I will go back and look at these strange fingers. Those strange fingers are not real fingers at all. They are like little sausages, you know, that are barely touching her head, and yet they come right out of, I am sure, Ingres' painting of Inez Mochassier, which he certainly could have seen. And that comes right out of this Marcantonio Raimondi engraving that was from Herculaneum. And Ingres, I discovered several years later in that Ingres exhibit in New York, there were dozens of drawings that Ingres had done of those fingers. He obviously was obsessed by those fingers. And that Manet picked up on them and put them in that painting. Also, the way the painting kind of falls apart, that it's fragmented, that really bothered his contemporaries. I mean, Manet suffered enormous terrible reviews that because of the way he painted, that he was slapdash, that he was willful, that he used no perspective, that he really he had terrible, his compositions were weak, they were oversimplified, but I think he was simply headed somewhere else, and I think he was looking back as much as he was looking forward, but he was covering his tracks in a way, because nobody really put together what he was doing. But I think the fragmentation in his canvases, and we'll just go on, is another thing that drove his contemporaries wild. I mean, Bouguereau is a contemporary. I mean, and he was making so much money on his painting, he said, I lose 10 francs every time I go take a pee. You know, he was doing so well. Manet was not in the same boat at all. But the series of paintings I'm going to show you now all look like they could have been done from photographs. That he's simplifying certain things, that he's putting figures together, maybe that all don't come from the same photograph, but he's diverting his gaze. Walheim talks again about the gaze in these paintings being diverted so that that people don't necessarily look at each other, that there's always this sense of mystery in his paintings. And I agree with him completely. There is always a sense of mystery in Manet's paintings, the way he puts them together. I don't think he understands why he might have had this strange diversion. Now, I put this cyclotic idol in there just to make sure you're not going to sleep. Because one of the things that strikes me about Manet's paintings is that you always have this feeling of being inside out, that often you can identify with the person whom he's painted in the sense of almost being in her skin. And I'm not putting in the one of Victorine Murat of, what is it called? On the Olympia, thank you. He just does try to make her feel like a real person. Actually, she was a model for a photographer. And I think that's another clue about how Manet could go to his friend Daguerre and he could get lots of photographs made up for himself. Most of the photographs that artists used at that time were in the public domain. They were photographs everybody had access to, and so they could recognize them immediately. But I've always been struck by the cyclotic idol that there are no eyes, there's the nose, there are the shoulders, there are the arms because they get chopped off, and that's a piece of sculpture. You know, so they're tucked in like this. And look in the knees, as if you are the cyclotic idol. You can look down and be aware of your shoulders. You can be aware of your nose. You can look down and maybe be aware of your knees. But it's almost as if you are inside that figure, and the back is forgotten. The back, the head, we don't see the back of our head. You know, it's not important. It's what the person inside that form is aware of in relation to being a person. And this is the painting that's in the RISD Museum of Berthe Morisot, who was his sister-in-law. And even the latest review of Manet by Sheldal I read, he doesn't seem to get it, that Berthe Morisot was his sister-in-law, and it's clearly he was in love with her, that he did these wonderful paintings of her that are so intense. He made this deal with his father. His father was a judge. Manet had been in the Navy. He was going to make a career of the Navy. He had to be supported. His father made a deal with him that if he married his mistress and raised his illegitimate son, that he would support him as an artist. And I learned that through Bill Scott, who knew Julie Manet, who is Berthe Morisot's daughter, and knew the family very well because he put together the Berthe Morisot exhibit that Mount Holyoke mounted on their 100th anniversary, and that went on to the National Gallery in Washington and the Ammon Carter Museum. So it's like inside information, and yet every book I've read kind of tries to figure out, well, why, you know, what is this with his Dutch wife, you know, and what is this putative son that's in a number of the paintings? Well, he made a bargain with the devil in a way, that he kind of, it gave him the freedom to pursue his career, but it must have left this strange gap in his life in another sense that I think really affected him. Now this is another painting of a seated woman in a white dress, and the form and the way that this is done, picking out the simplest form and reducing the painting to a few important tones is so different from the Georges Clairin painting of Sarah Bernhardt, which is done about the same time, that probably was done from a photograph, that has an infinite number of details, and yet you almost can't make out what it is. Is this about dogs or fabric or something on a sofa. I mean, it's really hard to tell what this is about. And the Cycladic idol does not come up in this image. This is a painting that Manet did when he was more influenced by the Impressionists, that he really precedes the Impressionists, but he was certainly influenced by them. There's a great painting of Sada dress in the Philadelphia Museum, which has always been one of my favorite paintings. But this is Argenté, which is, and here the man is looking at her, or is he? And she is looking out, maybe over a little bit to the left. It's hard to say. But there's always this diverted gaze in these images. And this is in the Yale Museum, again, why I would choose it. Wollheim has said that he put the cat and the two oranges in there at the end because, I'm sorry, am I in your way? I should try to not be in your way. Because he needed to bring the painting back to being a painting. And that's possible because Wollheim is always talking about it's only human beings who can perceive that this is actually a painting. You know, cats might go up and sniff it, and maybe there's some oil, or they won't get that this is a woman dressed in a Spanish costume sitting on a sofa. But it's not hard for me to imagine sitting here, lying here, posing for this, like, boy, that costume looks uncomfortable, and she doesn't look like it was her choice of what to wear that day. But, you know, she's probably being paid well enough to want to sit there. But I think that the cat and the oranges are there for a different reason. They're there to establish something in the foreground and also to establish something that's a different proportion than the figure. That he often, we know from various states of his paintings, added things like these kinds of details toward the end. But this is a Velázquez of Anna Maria of Austria, or I think that's right. And if you take out that, I don't know, is it a clock in the background? If you just cover it over and look at it, she simply becomes a giantess. She becomes enormous. That you need that there to establish the proportions of the painting. And I put it in partly to say that, but partly to say Manet looked and looked and looked at Velázquez. Velázquez and most of the Spanish painters were extremely important to him. Degas was looking at Italian paintings and had Italian relatives. Manet was looking at Spanish paintings. And this is another painting that you suspect may have been done from a photograph, that it's a snapshot of her. Maybe not taken in a cafe, but he's making up the scene around him, and frequently you feel like the scenes around him are made up. Again, this absence of presence in the main figure in this. Her looking away, her not being quite there, her a kind of mysterious absence in that seems quite consistent in his work. And this is the last painting I'm going to talk about and go on to why I'm going to talk about this one. There was well, I'll go ahead a little bit and look at this. This is the Concert Champêtre by Titian that Marc Antonio Raimondi made an engraving of, that Manet used for this painting, of a sort of scene on the grass, déjeuner sur l'herbe, lunch on the grass it's called. And you have, I mean, it's questionable, you know, I think that we can all make remarks about this. I'm sure feminists have written about this from the beginning of feminism. But what's interesting about the painting is how it's put together, how the still life feels like, well, that was one issue, and it's in this corner over here. And the figure in the background was, she's kind of above and in back of the other figures, but it's as if the figures were accumulated separately and put in the painting, and that's the way the painting was put together. And you could say the same thing of the Titian. that the Titian feels like it's put together that way, very unlike most Renaissance paintings, where the structure of the space would be established and the figures would be located in that space. And probably with very different motives, but again, the guy in the middle, you know, where is he looking and what is going on here? And the simplicity with which he puts the painting together and how much difficulty people had in accepting this kind of slapdash painting at the time. The Titian is also put together with figures. I mean, if you look at the nude on the right, the way she seems to simply be sort of set into the scene, that not built into that space so much as just kind of pushed into that piece of hillside there. And again, going back to the idea of all the things you bring to a painting looking at it, you get water being poured and you kind of hear the water being poured and music being played and people talking and the shepherd in the background and maybe a feeling of being out in nature and the wind blowing. I mean, you bring all kinds of things, all the things that Mondrian would have happily eliminated any reference to at all, to just talk about the painting. But that particular painting stimulated Picasso late in his life to do a whole series, he was more engaged in this series of paintings than any other copies that he did or identities that he had with another artist. That he did like 200 drawings, almost 30 paintings, and several lino cuts. And he spent 2 years working on this one subject of just working from the Déjeuner sur l'herbe. And certainly he had an identity with Manet. But what is really going on, this sense of he's an older painter, he may not be getting quite the same attention that he's used to getting. And he is talking about work and just working on these images and turning out one after another. And it's really true that you almost have to see a series of Picasso's work to understand what he's doing, rather than, and I know that I'll never forget reading that Francois Gillot's book of living with Picasso, and Picasso would say, okay, I'm going to take a nap, now I want you to do a copy of this painting I'm working on and bring it up to this point so that I have another version of it and I can continue it this way or I can continue it this way. Matisse finally got somebody into his studio to take photographs of various states of a painting, and Picasso just did various states of a painting. So we have 200 drawings and 30 paintings of this one subject that he did over a period of 2 years. And just they're intensely about the artist sitting here on the right, looking at the nude and drawing her in most cases. But he seems to be just going through this making, this faire, fare, fecit, or this making, doing of producing these images one after another. And yes, as I warned you in the beginning, this is an Ingres painting that I want to talk about. I said I wanted to talk something about what painting means to different artists, and the Picassos are, he's not copying the Déjeuner sur l'herbe so much as he's using it to sort of put the eye to work in his own painting. I want to talk about projection in Ingres. That this is called Antiochus and Stratonice, and the Antiochus is the figure between the two columns on the right that you can't really see, and his son is lying in bed, and Antiochus has taken on this beautiful young woman and discovers that his son is dying because he's in love with her. And Walheim makes the point that that Ang is distorting the space to express something that's very important to him. That Ang had two very profound motives in his painting. One of them being that his father had been a local artist and a dandy and an artist and a sort of an untrained artist, and made a point of getting his son to go to Paris and study with David and have a real chance at being a real artist. And at one point, Ang did a portrait of his father, which is just one of the weakest paintings he must have done. It really doesn't, hold up to his standard of portraiture, which is significant. I mean, his portraits are amazing, but this is a father in this painting who is relenting to his son, and he's trying to humanize his father, and that part of the emotion of the painting is the way he's contracted the space. That the columns don't really seem to be in the straight line that they are in. That the figure of Stratonice it's as if she's standing right against that column on the left, and yet the column has to be way back on the other side of the bed in the painting. I think that artists do these things all the time anyway, but I think Wollheim has an interesting point about what Ang's motives might have been to do this. This is a self-portrait. Baudelaire said that Ang's portraits have a despotic gaze, that there is something very intense about the gaze of the figures. And one of the portraits that I've always loved, I think this is a great painting, of a publisher named Jean-François Bertin, I think it is. And he was a very successful man, and when Ang got this commission to do his portrait, he worked very, very hard. In fact, Ang acquired back his own paintings to try to continue working on them. He copied work, he traced work, he copied his students' work, he traced his own drawings, he cut them up and put them together in paintings. After he got out of David's studio, he was not successful. The newspapers in Paris said, "Oh, who is this ambitious young upstart who's over-dramatizing in his paintings?" And so he went off to Rome for several years. Did a lot of portraits. After all, Napoleon had just conquered Rome, and so he had a certain clientele there. But when he came back to France, he certainly had quite a reputation at that point. And so he had this commission, and at one point while working on this painting, he was beside himself, and he burst into tears and just didn't know, was distraught. And I got this picture reading about this that was really amazing. After lunch, now what was this? Was this in Ang's house? Like after lunch, they all decided they had lunch, and Bertin said to him, "Oh, don't worry about it. You know, you're going to be fine. You know, the painting's coming. You know, don't. You know, I will pose for you endlessly, forever. You know, don't." And Ang was just overwhelmed with his support and his support, his feeling that he hadn't completely disgraced himself by bursting into tears, saying, "I just can't do this. I just can't do this." And then there's another story about him being in Bertin's house, and Bertin's arguing with his sons and saying, the sons were saying, "Oh, you're completely wrong. You know, it's like this. It's like this." And Bertin's saying, "Oh, yeah, no, I really think it's like this." And Ang wrote about this later and saying, he was just so astonished that Bertin could hold on to his own point of view when being confronted by his son's disapproval and different point of view, and that he even made him stronger, that said Ang, that he could disagree with them and that was fine. But I think this is one of his greatest portraits. I think that here again there is this gaze coming right out of the painting this despotic gaze, as Baudelaire called it. And yet, in this case, it's not so despotic. I think that Ingres has given him a powerful but sympathetic look coming out of this painting. Now, I'm going to talk about Poussin for a few minutes. He's always been a favorite painter. I certainly didn't like him when I was young. He struck me as stuffy and melodramatic, and yet I've totally abandoned that idea. We spent a vacation in London, a spring break, where I spent every day in a Poussin show drawing and drawing and drawing from Poussin. And one of the things that struck me is that the figures were divorced often from the landscape. And then I read something. In fact, everyone was there. Pierre Rosenberg was there. I mean, you know, a lot of my colleagues from Smith were there, and they were talking to all these people. And I learned that Poussin made up models in his studio and arranged them so that he could paint them. And so they always do feel somewhat separate from the landscape he puts around them. And I love the way this figure of St. John on Patmos, he's just plopped down into the space and he's holding this book up in front of him. I mean, how long could you sit there reading like that? It's a most improbable, and I remember drawing and drawing this, and I can't quite put the legs together with the hips together with the back. It's really a difficult figure, and yet it is graceful and it has so much tension that it really is a very important piece of this landscape that kind of comes up like this, that kind of goes back and then comes back and then goes back and then comes back. It doesn't make a big, I don't know, like a Claude or Thomas Cole or some kind of landscape that goes on and on and on. It builds up as well. And this painting by Poussin called Echo on Narcissus, this is a painter who borrows constantly texts from the Bible, from Picasso, from Ovid. A lot of his stories come from Ovid, but there was only one painting left in his studio when he died. I mean, he'd sold everything, you know. He got commissions to do paintings, and he did extremely well. And there are many Poussins all over the world. It's interesting to track them, to see where they are. But I always felt this figure was odd, and had a model pose like this once, and she fell asleep. I mean, she was perfectly comfortable. It wasn't a good painting. I didn't like it. But I think that it's an odd pose. It's a pose that the way the figure is laid out, it's right before Narcissus dies. You know, he's fallen in love with his own image, and it simply he succumbs to this love affair with his own image. And here's Echo up here, who's pronounced that should be his fate. He should fall in love with him, you know, with someone that I can't quite remember what the myth is, but she's gotten her wish, but he's fallen in love with himself. But she had pursued him, and he was very unresponsive. But this figure seems to me to have a lot in common with this Ambrogio Lorenzetti, which is part of a big mural in Siena of a fallen figure. And just the way the hands are arranged and the way the body is sort of arranged up is very much like the figure of Narcissus in that painting by Poussin. And this is bad government. We know about that. And this is an Balthus where he's taken that same figure of Narcissus and in this female figure in the foreground, and simply made her back legs, it looks like it's almost a little bit shorter than the front leg. And so it's above and behind as much as, but this is to comment about, as I said in the beginning, I wanted to talk about how artists look at other painters. I mean, we're lifting images. I could go on all night. I could do a whole talk on just lifting images. But the figure in the foreground of the Testament of Eudemias is the most interesting figure often in Poussins are the figures in the foreground, whether they're pouring water or this is the scribe sitting next to this man who's dying. But it's a fantastic figure. I mean, the way this figure is arranged in the space, I'm talking about the figure in the foreground of the scribe, that obviously that was Poussin's interest in putting these figures together, and there's frequently this sense of tension and rectitude in Poussin, as if, you know, there's some moral message in any one of his paintings, no matter what he's talking about. There's nothing debauched or degraded, that it's always this sort of high ideal of human and human outrage at the massacre of the innocents. This is a very unusual composition by him. It's interesting to look at the way he put it together, the way the figures make this kind of circle, or almost an 8, the way his arm circles around and her circles back to her, and the figure in the background that becomes almost a vertical, holding up the painting on the right side, and then this huge column on the left side, and then these figures that are kind of fit in between his legs and in front of her leg, that establish the background. That it's a very shallow space, really, to dramatize the story. I mean, most Massacre of the Innocents have dozens of babies being slaughtered and mothers in total despair, which of course they would be. And this is a Ewan Uglow copy of that painting, which Uglow is one of the most interesting contemporary English painters who died, I think it must have been 3 or 4 years ago. And this is another painting of his, just to say something about him, about the tension in the figure, the way, why he would be drawn to someone like Poussin and want to copy him. I don't know how this person posed, but sort of halfway in, halfway out of this chair, but it's a wonderful structure in this painting. And that's what I always feel in Poussin, that it is in such an incredible structure that he built in the painting. And this is a Bacchanal, or it's a Triumph of Pan, and it's a painting that Picasso worked from a great deal. But the thing that interested me about this painting, that seeing it in this exhibition, what I became fascinated by was the still life in the foreground, and how important it was that when you're standing in front of this painting, what you become aware of, which almost takes you by surprise, is this image of the foreground that looks like a body with the mask tossed aside, or another mask tossed aside, and these things strewn around in relation to it. But when you see it in reproduction, you don't think of that. You almost have to experience the painting itself to have this underpinning come out at you and speak to itself. Now, I'm coming to the end. This is going back to Titian, this is a much later Titian than the Conte Champêtre, and it's a painting that, again, has always fascinated me. The last time I showed it, somebody said, "Why do you show that? It doesn't have anything to do with your work whatsoever." May or may not be true. It's a story of Tarquin and Lucretius. Tarquin was a Etruscan that leader. He was the head of Rome until the Latins kind of took over, and, well, if you believe Aeneas or Virgil, like Aeneas, and Tarquin. This is one of the Tarquins who's raping the wife of one of his fellow family members, and it is so many years after the event that Titian is actually painting this, but it's the structure, the way he puts this together. It's the way he is the eyes meet each other. He did several versions of this, and in most of them she is looking away and he is maybe looking at her, but they're not making eye contact. The way they make eye contact in this painting, and the way Titian will choose a moment to perfectly dramatize the emotional sense of an event, that it's almost like a sacrifice in this painting, that here is this knife and here is this helpless woman, and there's a viewer over on the left of the painting that is watching the event, just as you are a viewer watching the event. And this is a late painting that Titian did called The Flaying of Marsyas, which Panofsky and another art historian had heard about this painting but didn't believe it existed because it sounded so grim. And it turned up fairly recently in the collection of the Archbishop in Kromerz, Czechoslovakia. And he had bought it, one of the archbishops in the 1600s had bought it at auction. It was a painting that Titian signed, so we know it was a Titian. And it is such an outrageously gruesome painting of suffering, and yet when you realize that even in the 1500s, the plague was continuing to come through Venice and regularly wipe out a major portion of the population, that it was something Venetians and many European cities suffered from continually. There would be recurrences of the plague. We think it belongs to the 1300s, or it's not. It doesn't. It was something that recurred and recurred in Europe and in England and in farther east, certainly. And that there had been a tremendous outbreak of the plague, and this painting is about the contest between Apollo and Pan lost, and his punishment was to be flayed alive. And Wollheim talks about it as it is really about Titian's statement as suffering, but the acceptance of suffering, and that it's kind of a metaphor for painting itself, that the painter suffers and suffers, trying to make paintings, and the expression on Marsyas's face is not one of pain so much as of acceptance of this is what I have chose to do, and this is the way I am going to deal with it. And that it's similar to an engraving that Giulio Romano had done that was in Mantua that Titian certainly saw. But this painting is very large, and the way it was originally, or that it is originally ordered, the navel of Marsyas is right in the middle of the painting, is a kind of the heart of the matter, so to speak, that it is as if the whole thing is one big skin, and that the painting itself is one large surface, like a skin, like the skin that you could touch. And the last painting that he did, which was left in his studio, is about the plague, was a year later, was that he did a painting that maybe he's projecting, just like I think that Ang is projecting in his paintings, hoping his paintings can do something, can solve this problem between him and his father. And I think that his obsessive working on them, I mean, I can identify with that. I think that painters will get into these things about painting that it's not as if you want to follow all the rules, it's you want to get the painting, which is over here. It has nothing to do with just following the rules and doing a painting. It has something with trying to get something, so you're projecting something into the painting. And here is Titian doing this Pietà almost as an homage, hoping that he and his son will live through this next round of the plague, which they do not. And now this is the last. This is I'm going to talk a little bit about Matisse, I had some quotes that I wanted to keep here because they were so interesting. Matisse is certainly a painting who interests me a lot. I mean, in Mondrian, yes, but I'm not following him where I can't follow him, or I haven't followed him. Or Matisse's interest in color and his color as expression has always interested me more. And I like the way his color is often not beautiful, or we accept it, this pink and this red and this sort of flittery little background, or this image of these two women together who the way it makes such a dynamic statement in the painting, not to mess with the color but to put it down straight. And Liebenstein made, or somebody made a list of all the ideas about painting from the time of Plato that make color come as a secondary concern. Color really wasn't important. Drawing is the important thing. And Matisse sort of defies that. Really, it's very important how dramatically he defies that. But he certainly was looking at Cézanne, and this is a late Cézanne. When Cézanne was a young man, he was asked to fill out this form, like, what's your favorite color? What's your favorite piece of music? Who's your favorite painter? And he said Rubens. Mm-hmm. And so I put this Rubens in here, that Cézanne is, Matisse is looking at Cézanne and taking what he's taking. And Cézanne wouldn't approve at all what Matisse did with it. That there is a real relationship between this and this detail from the Rubens and this detail from the painting of Cézanne's I just showed you. This is a painting that Matisse did in Corsica when he was quite young, and he went there trying to. He left Moreau's studio, and Moreau said, "Go out in the street and paint, and go to the Louvre. This is your path. This is what you should do." So he goes to Corsica to paint, and he sends images back to a lot of his friends, and they say, "Looks like you're gnashing your teeth," or "It looks panicky." Like, we think this is terrific. We look at something like this, and we think, this looks like a decent painting. You've done from life. We believe it. It's trustworthy. And after he did the blue nude, this is the painting that Matisse showed next. It's in the Barnes collection in Philadelphia. Mm-hmm. And with the new Barnes, maybe we'll be able to see it. You don't have to climb up to the top of the stairs, turn around, and look at it in this stairwell. But this painting is a painting that Matisse sort of went from the Fauve period to doing the blue nude after going to Corsica. And then this painting called Le Bonheur de la Vivre, and it's the joy of life. And it's a painting that I think Matisse himself found so problematic that he walked away from this one also. But and it was so badly received, and I wanted to just read one of the wonderful reviews by Signac of this painting. But Signac was hardly alone. Matisse, whose attempts I have liked up to now, seems to me to have gone to the dogs. Upon a canvas of 2.5 meters, it was the largest painting that Matisse had done to that date, he has surrounded some strange characters with a line as thick as your thumb. Then he has covered the whole thing with flat, well-defined tints, which, however pure, seem disgusting. And those rosy flesh tones. It evokes the worst of painters, the most detestable of cloisonnism, like cloisonné, the multicolored shop fronts of the merchants of paints, varnishes, and household goods. Mm-hmm. And that is, and he was hardly alone. I mean, this painting was definitely trashed by everyone who saw it. But it's interesting to see how it marks exactly where Matisse is and where he's going. That if you look at the couple in the corner, that's straight out of a Titian, so he's looking back. If you look at the dancers in the middle, it's probably out of a Poussin. I'm sure he was looking at Poussin. That's like the dance to the music of time, the painting of Poussin's that shows dancers in a ring like that. There could have been other sources too, but it seems that this idea of cutting out images and placing them in the canvas the way Poussin was working, had worked. This is in the 1600s, and we're now in the 20th century. And Puvis du Chauvin, who was working at the same time and looks very old-fashioned compared to Matisse, but a very important, there's a book that's just been published by Amy Brown Price, Yale Press, on Puvis du Chauvin. He was a very important painter to painters like Leland Bell recently. But he's certainly looking backwards, and here is the figure that's in the corner of the painting, out of a Titian, and he certainly was looking at Van Gogh. And here's a quote from Van Gogh that I thought fits in here. "I don't follow any brushstroke system. I daub the paint onto the canvas in uneven strokes, which I leave as they are, patches of thickly laid on color, places where here and there where the canvas is still bare, portions that are left completely unfinished, parts I've gone back over rough in quality. The final result is, I am convinced, disturbing and irritating enough not to please people with preconceived ideas of technique." And I think that this kind of roughness that is in Van Gogh, that's in Cézanne, that is so much part of that painting. This is the last painting. No, not quite the last painting, but one thing. No, there's one more. Okay, this is the last painting, but I want to talk about this one. Certainly, he is looking at the Morocco and the color that he found in Morocco, and this is a very large painting, and he's also. This is a very late painting. This is a painting, the Moroccan painting is done, I think, in 1912, and this is probably in late 1940s, 50s. But there's just one more thing I wanted to add about Matisse, and that is that someone took a movie of him, and he was horrified when he saw it. He said he felt naked, like he was just shocked that the movie left him feeling so exposed. And we're again talking about the eye and how seeing things can be so disturbing and be just disturbing to a person that he said, when I'm drawing or painting, I'm groping my way as if I'm in a dark space, and that seeing this movie of him painting made him very upset. He didn't like that. And another comment, it's gone right out of my head. Isn't that wonderful? Let's call it a day. All right.